afternoon, nerds. So it is Saturday, the Saturday before Halloween, and October is almost over, which is kind of crazy. And I just had the urge to film a video, and I didn't feel like starting because I'm still right in the middle of my October TBR, and I haven't finished all the books yet. But I did want to film something, and I thought, well, why not just a quick sit-down video talking about horror. So I don't know if you guys are coming from Goodreads, you probably already know this, or Cannonball Read, but I am relatively new to horror, like a year and a half, 2 years I've really been reading it. And I mean, I don't like all horror. I like certain kinds of horror, mostly psychological horror, but I have been reading Stephen King for 10, 15 years now. I don't remember when I first read Eyes of the Dragon. That's the book that convinced me that I liked Stephen King, and like, hey, he's a really good writer, so I might not love the stories, but I might. So I kept trying, and then like I liked every book. So here we are. But I am pretty new to actual horror because I thought I just liked Stephen King. And then I don't actually know, but like a switch flipped and I was like, well, let's try this out. And then I just kept going. And probably a lot of that has to do with like, that's around when I started watching BookTube, and a lot of the BookTubers that I watch like horror a lot, and they made it sound really fun. All of that is to say, I went through the list of horror books that I have shelved on Goodreads, and I now have a top 10 newbies, well, horror newbies list of horror books. And these are not like what this is not, to be clear, these are the best 10 horror books list. That's not what this is. These are my favorite 10 horror books currently. I could read one tomorrow and knock one of these off. So, and actually this was a really pretty easy list to make because I haven't read that many. I mean, I've read quite a few, and I've read a lot of books with horror elements, but like not a lot that are true horror besides Stephen King. So there are Stephen King books on this list because he's the most, I've read the most of his stuff. Like I would still say that most of the horror I've read is Stephen King horror, but I'm branching out and I'm reading other stuff. I want to talk about my 10 favorite horror books so far. That's what we're going to do. So I am going to go in order from 10 to 1. And I don't have a script or anything planned, so I'm just gonna do this off the cuff, hopefully get this video in under 20 minutes and move on with my day. So here we go. Okay, so this one I had a tough time with because this is an author that I really love, like a lot of people do, and that's Kingfisher. And I've read 3 of her horror books. So I've read What Moves the Dead. Oh no, I've read 4 now. The Hollow ones I literally just finished this morning. Sorry, The Hollow Places. And then The Twisted Ones, which I read earlier this month, and A House with Good Bones. So I don't think this is the popular opinion. I think that most people's favorite is The Hollow Places. I think actually my second favorite is The Twisted Ones, just because the image of this monster thing that she puts in there, like it's in my head, and I don't think it's ever leaving. And it's funny and scary at the same time, so it like is just sticking in there. But overall, this is the horror book of hers that I've had the best time with. I just liked everything about this. So this is a book about a entomological archaeologist. Like she studies bugs in archaeological ruins. Her dig gets canceled and she doesn't have anywhere to stay. She's back home with her mom, but things are weird. Like, so her mom had a terrible relationship with her grandmother, who was, T. Kingfisher must have had an evil grandmother because a lot of these books have evil grandmothers in them. But she was a real piece of work, but she's dead. When the daughter comes home, her name is, what's her name? Sam. So when Sam comes home, immediately she starts noticing things are very weird, that her mom is acting very strangely and something is going on. And there's vultures watching the house. That's where the vulture is, because there's a witch that lives down the street, and just either she or they have decided together that they're going to collectively watch over this house because something bad's going on there. And it's just like quirky stuff like that happens. And her other books are very similar to each other. This one feels different. So I don't know. I just like it. I like it. It was like horror with a happy ending. It's like cozy horror. I really feel like that's becoming a thing, is cozy horror. And I think that I just had to have a T. Kingfisher on here, and this has been my favorite one of hers so far that is horror. Oh Lord, forgive me if this is a terrible one. Okay, so next up is a book that I feel like no one ever talks about, but because I'm reading every single one of Stephen King's books, I read it. I read it last year, and it has not left my head, and that is The Dark Half. So I got this creepy old paperback version. I do want a better edition, but I really like Stephen King old paperbacks for some reason, and this cover is creepy and weird. Those are birds, but it looks like it. I love when he writes about writers. That's one of my favorite things that he does. And this book follows a writer, and his name is Thad Beaumont, and he has recently become a father of twins, and also his pseudonym has recently been discovered. So like Stephen King did in the 80s, he had a pseudonym where he wrote different books to the ones that he writes under his own name, and he was found out. And there's this, they do this elaborate spread, a photo shoot in a magazine, and he officially kills off the pseudonym. And he says, I'm not going to write under this pseudonym anymore. This pseudonym is dead, much like Stephen King did metaphorically with Richard Bachman. A lot of people have a theory that this book was written in spite to the people who caught him out for that pseudonym, but I don't think that's what this is. I think this is like a deep psychological look at the mind of a writer. And also, the book, this is where it really got me. I think it opens up with the main character Thad as a kid, and he starts having hallucinations, I think of sparrows, but they're definitely birds, and he's got these blinding headaches, and long story short, they give him an x-ray or an MRI or something, and they find a mass in his head. So he's having surgery at the very beginning of this book. It's a prologue. And when the surgeon gets in there, what he finds is not a tumor or a mass or anything like that. He finds the remains of Thad's twin, who he resorbed, just like Dwight in The Office, into his own body. And there's an eyeball, and then there's teeth. So that's creepy as hell, and that's a real thing that happens. So anyway, they remove the eyeball and the teeth from Thad's brain, and he's cured. But then after this pseudonym is killed, it seems very much like the pseudonym has come to life and is coming after Thad and his family in revenge for Thad killing him. So it's just, it's pretty big, but honestly, I had such a good time with this book. It's set in the same town as, what's that book? As Needful Things, which I think is Castle Rock. I think this is a Castle Rock book. And so we get the sheriff, who I like, whose name I'm forgetting right now because I didn't prepare for this video. I think that the reason this is my favorite is because I do like psychological horror so much. This is literally a monster born from his own brain, and it gets really dark, but it also has like a really strong through line where this scary thing is coming after people, and they're trying to figure out what's going on because he has an alibi for these murders, but his fingerprints are at the scene, but his alibi is ironclad, and it was just a really good time. It actually reminded me a lot of the beginning of The Outsider, if you guys ever read that book, but I think it sticks the landing in a way that The Outsider did not for me. So yeah, The Dark Half, this is a great book. If this is one you've missed and you like Stephen King, I would highly suggest that you check this one out. Okay, so next up is one that I just read also, and that is a classic of the genre, and that's Rosemary's Baby. So I read this actually, and you'll find out in my wrap up the full story, but I had another book initially where this book was in place, and I just couldn't deal with it. Like the audio was not working for me, and I didn't want to ruin the book. Like I wanted to enjoy the book, so I stopped, and I've had to scramble to find new audio, and this is the book that I found. And I had such a good time with this book. Like there is a reason this book is a classic, and I'm putting it on this list. The suspense was so well done. Like it was very quiet, but very intense. The experience of this woman who moves into this fancy rich apartment with her husband, and everything seems to be going well, and then somebody in the building dies, and then she gets pregnant, and then just weird stuff after weird stuff keeps happening. And like it's just a story of a woman who is gaslit all to hell, and her perception is shifted, and she's used. And the way that it all comes together at the end was just so great. And if the audiobook was good, it wasn't a super great recording because it was from like 2005 or 2006, but it is Mia Farrow doing the narration. I've never seen the movie because of Roman Polanski. If it's ever on somewhere where I'm not going to give him royalties, I might watch it. But the book is great, and it wasn't super scary. Like it doesn't have those vibes, which is why I like it, and it's psychological. Like she's going through it and nobody is listening to her, and it's great. So yeah, I gave that 5 stars. And then number 7, we've got our second Stephen King. I told you there's going to be, I mean, he's not on this whole list, but I couldn't make a list of my top 10 favorite horror books and leave off Misery. So this was probably the book of his, I think I read this right after reading, this was the first one I read after reading Eyes of the Dragon and thinking that I wanted to continue and see if I could read his horror and if I liked horror. And sure enough, I did. I gave this 5 stars. Also, the audiobook is great. Lindsay Krause reads the narration, at least the version that I read. I don't know if there's another one. She's a lady from season 4 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That's how I know her anyway. But she does the Kathy Bates really well. So if you're somehow unaware, this is a book, again, about a writer. And his name is Paul Sheldon. And he's celebrating the completion of his latest book. He's driving drunk down the freeway and a snowstorm starts, and he gets into a terrible car accident. And I believe, I can't remember if it's one leg or two, but his legs are shattered. And Annie Wilkes, who's his #1 fan, finds him on the side of the road because she lives just down the road. And I think she buries his car. Anyway, he wakes up in her house and she's got him drugged and then she keeps him captive. Like, he doesn't have a cell phone. He doesn't have any way to get out of there. She is clearly not well. The toxic relationship that forms between them is fascinating. She's a fascinating villain. I think she's my favorite Stephen King villain. I might retract that if I thought about it longer, but at the moment, she's my favorite as I sit here and think about it. The writing, so the way that he immerses himself in the writing of this book, because she finds out that this book that he wrote where he killed off his most famous character, Misery, she's livid. And she's basically like, you're going to sit here and you're going to write me a book and you're going to bring her back to life. And writing that book brings him solace, and it keeps him sane while he's trying to figure out how to get out of this situation alive. And it gets pretty intense. She does some nasty stuff, and it's so claustrophobic, but in a really good way. This is just a really great book. Okay, now number 6, also one I just finished in September. I think what's happening is that last year at this time, I was buying a bunch of horror books and putting a bunch of horror books that were being published on my radar, and now it's coming due. I'm finally reading all of them, and so that's why a lot of these are more recent. And so number 6 is Black Sheep by Rachel Harrison. I love this book so much. So I really like Rachel Harrison's writing style. She writes, again, cozy horror, I would say, although this is her least cozy horror that I've read. I have not read her first book, The Return, which also doesn't sound super cozy, but Cackle and Such Sharp Teeth both were on the cozy horror side. They were mixed with other genres. This one, I was on another level. I really feel like she's leveled up. The actual writing of it was great. I was cracking up throughout. It's so funny, and it's definitely a more black humor. And the main character, Vesper, has this judgmental, dark look on the world, but it's extremely entertaining. Not in a way that makes you upset and depressed. It makes you laugh. I'm not going to go too far into the premise aside to say that this is about a woman who essentially left her cultish religion and town at the age of 17, almost 18, and hasn't been back for 6 or 7 years. And she gets an invitation to a wedding. Unclear who sent her this invitation, because it's pretty unlikely that the groom and bride would have sent it to her, seeing as how they're her former best friend and her former boyfriend who are now together and getting married. And they're still very much in this religion/cult. But she gets so mad, something pulls her to go back and visit her family for the first time. And it's only when she's there that she realizes that's probably a really bad idea. But I'm going to stop there, because then, of course, the weird horror elements start coming in. But there were several twists in this book that just delighted me. I predicted one, but not the other. And then the ending of it was just, it gets wild. If you want a horror book that is just a fun, good time, that sort of is a satire on religion, then this is a really good one. I enjoyed it so much, and I can't stop thinking about it. Number 4, again, a pretty recent read. I read it over the summer. I also did the audio, and that is The Good House by Tananarive Due. And the audiobook was by Robin Miles. Again, it's an older recording, but it's really good quality. So if you like audiobooks, she does a great job. So this is a haunted house story, but it's more in the vein of an epic, Like if epic fantasy is a genre, or like a family saga is a genre, then this is like a weird combo of both of those things, but horror, because it follows 3 generations of this family who live in this house called the Good House, which was originally named for its owner, Elijah Good with an E. He left the house to his lover, who was a Black woman, and this was controversial, but soon the house in her name developed a reputation, because she was a healer, as being a place of goodness, so it was called the Good House. But she also one night got into some really dark stuff that has then followed her family across the years. And so we get excerpts from her, but the main character, if we really had to say there was one, is Angela Toussaint, and it's her grandmother that owned the house and left it to her. And Angela's son Corey are the 3 main perspectives. We get the grandmother in like a book and journals, and then we get Angela's first person point of view in the period of time that's like the most future present tense, after her son has died and they're trying to figure out what happened to him. And then we also get Corey's point of view 2 years earlier and what happened to lead up to his death. And it just was so absorbing, and the characterization was so good, and what was going on in this town and in this house was so creepy. And I've said this before in my Summerween vlog, but this is like if a woman wrote like Stephen King, just like, I mean, it's a pretty long book. It is small font, big pages, 480. And it was so absorbing. I don't even know how to talk about it so clearly. I mean, the legacy of like trauma that comes down through generations. And then of course, because she's a Black woman, there's this issues of race, and Black masculinity is a theme in here that I thought was really well done. So I don't know, so good. Like, this isn't like people wandering around in a house being scared by spirits. That's not what this is. It is much more complicated and satisfying than that. It also has one of the best endings in a horror book that I've ever read. Just so cathartic and satisfying. What did I do? Why is this so confusing? Hold on. 9, 10. No, I've got 10. What's happening? Why can't I do numbers? I switched one and I forgot to change the number. This is number 5. That's why there's 4 more. This is number 5. I got it. Okay. So that makes number 4. It by Stephen King. So I kind of can't believe this is on this list, and I kind of can't believe that I read this. First of all, this is like, I have to hold this with like 2 hands basically, because it's so enormous. It is one of his epics, and this is like a true horror book though, so it's like another horror epic. That's why I say that Tananarive sort of writes in the tradition of Stephen King. She writes they have a similar style for this kind of book, which is a long, epic, intimate character study of characters being terrorized by elements that are out of their control. And this is like the ultimate example of that. Like, I know there's a lot of discussion. Well, first of all, the 2 things people discuss about this book, besides most people agreeing that clowns are terrifying, which I actually don't think that they're terrifying. I don't like them, but they're not terrifying to me. But the 2 things they talk about are a certain scene at the end of this book, and then why is it so long? And I don't exactly have answers for you about that scene. I feel like it was a mistake and he wouldn't put it in there nowadays. I'm not going to spoil anything. It sort of makes sense in context, but I'm completely willing to overlook that scene because of how epic and intense and engaging of a reading experience this book was. Like, this book puts you through it. You are with these losers, they call themselves the losers, from the age of like 11, 12 until they're adults. And we get them at the same time. The way that Stephen King does this is so smart. We're seeing these kids who are going after it, which is this entity that is terrorizing their town, which is Derry. I believe this one's Derry, yeah. And it sometimes takes the form of a clown, but it is not a clown. So if you are under the impression this is about a clown running around Maine and terrifying, that's not what's happening. It is like a cosmic entity that has inhabited Derry and terrorizes people because it feeds on their fear. And so these kids go after it, and half the book is them defeating it as children. But instead of the way the movie does it, so if you've seen the movie, it's different, where the first movie is split into their childhood and the second movie is their adulthood. They're paralleled all throughout the book. Like, we'll have a section with the kids, a section with the adults, a section with the kids, a section with the adults. And they all go on this parallel journey at the same time, because they again have to defeat it as adults, this time more permanently, hopefully. So the way that works out, you become so attached to these characters, and the thematic quality of the constant comparison between their childhood selves and their adult selves and what's been lost and what's changed is just an intense experience. And I can't explain it, so if you haven't read it, I mean, maybe other people have explained it before me, but it was just, I said in my review on Goodreads, I think I experienced it as not necessarily a 5-star book, in that it's definitely got its flaws. Oh my God, it's so heavy. But it is a 5-star reading experience. Like, I would read this again, even though it is 1,200 pages long. So this is my number 4. But because it does have those flaws, I couldn't, there were 3 other books that are perfect or almost perfect that go above this. So let's talk about those. Number 3 is a book I also read this year, and that is Grady Hendricks, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. So this is a satirical, almost campy horror book set in the 90s about a group of housewives who are in a book club. And actually their book club is a splinter book club because they threw a coup at their previous book club that was all about reading these boring, stuffy books that they hated. And now basically they read true crime books, and they read really trashy stuff that's fun. It's about their experiences as housewives in, is it South Carolina? Charleston, yeah. So they're in Charleston in the 90s. So this is technically historical fiction, but it is very much a book about using the monstrous, which is in this case a vampire, and all the stuff that he brings with him, which is stomach turning. I had a visceral reading experience with this book. Also, the audio is great, narrated by Bonnie Turpin. Just absolute, there was one part where I literally had to hold my gorgon or whatever you call it. I was ugh. And it's a visceral reading experience. So it's funny and it's satirical and it's poking fun at the patriarchal power structures that make up, the housewife's life in the 1990s. But it's also going after the racism of those same white people and how they're complicit in the structures that make it possible for this vampire to go after the Black community and sit up high on their hill, all safe, while terrible things are happening around them. Also, it goes after masculinity pretty hard, and the fact that the way that this vampire inveigles himself into this community is through the men and charming the men and taking advantage of the patriarchy to put these women down. It's just masterful. I have yet to read a horror book that more perfectly encapsulates social satire and actual important things to say in such a hard-hitting way as this book does. It would have been less hard-hitting without the humor and the camp and the monster than to just say that, structural racism exists, patriarchy exists, and it ruins people's lives. We see it here, and it was disgusting. Number 2, and that is The Last House on Needless Street. Read this last year, so finally one that isn't a relatively new read, but it's still within the last 2 years. So this is a book that I can't really tell you that much about, because the absolute experience of reading this deserves to be preserved for you. So if you haven't read it, all I can say at the beginning, besides that this is psychological horror and it will take you on a journey that you are not expecting, is that it follows 3 narrators. So the first narrator is Ted. He's not doing great. He lives in a house. It's falling down around him at the end of Needless Street, hence the name of the book. And he is still dealing with the fallout from the death of his mother. And he lives there sometimes with his daughter Lauren as well. And there's something off with her. And you're not sure what's going on. But it's instantly eerie. The second narrator is his cat. Cat POV. I don't know how to sell that any further for you guys. For anyone who, like, just cat POV. She's so great. She lives in this house with Ted. She thinks that all humans are Teds. So instead of saying humans, she says Teds. Whenever another human interacts with her, he's a Ted. She's a Ted. It's so great. Also, so she's religious. It's a religious cat. But she's very protective of Ted. And she's clearly, she knows more about what's going on than Ted does. Like, she knows where it's at. And then the third narrator is Dee. And her sister disappeared more than a decade earlier. I don't remember the exact timeline. And she is convinced, utterly convinced, that Ted is responsible and Ted kidnapped and killed her sister. So all of those ingredients together sort of move, and you feel one way at the beginning of the book about all these characters, and by the end, to say that there's been a turnaround is an understatement. Can't explain it, but there's a lot in here. There's a lot of heart in here. There's a lot of compassion. There's a lot about mental health and trauma. Definitely look up any content warnings for this one because it gets pretty intense. But I cannot recommend this book highly enough, especially if you like books, horror books that also have elements of thrillers in them, like where there's lots of twists and turns and like your perspective is thrown on its head time and time again. And it's, you know, it's psychological horror right here. This is the best one I've read so far. Okay, and that my number one, see if you can guess. I read this book last year. I became instantly obsessed with it. It will not leave my brain. It is sitting in there still. And its protagonist better have a happy ending because this is a trilogy. Now you know what it is. And that is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. So this is a book. It's the first in the trilogy. It was originally a standalone, but we'll see. I would like Jade, who's the main character, like I said, to have some peace, to get a happy ending, to be not the one that takes the blame and that takes the punishment the way that she has. I want her to have a good ending. Let's say that. But this first book, she is a high school senior, and she is a Blackfeet Indian living around a lake. This Indian Lake is the name of the trilogy now. It used to be called the Lake Witch Trilogy, but now it's Indian Lake. And she is biracial. Her mother was white and her father was Blackfeet. And her mother took off when she was a child, leaving her alone with her neglectful / possibly abusive dad. Certainly he's drunk all the time and he can't really provide for her. And she doesn't have a great home life. Understatement. And she is obsessed with slasher movies. Like, when I say obsessed, I mean take the most obsessed person that you've ever met over about any obsession and then multiply that times 100. And you might reach Jade's level of obsession and knowledge and passion with the horror genre, with the slasher movies. So half of this book is her being convinced that a real life slasher is happening in her town. And she thinks she knows what's going on and she wants to prevent loss of life. She thinks she's identified the final girl, who's a new, beautiful, popular girl named Letha, who's just moved to her town. And she's convinced Letha's the final girl. So she wants to make friends with her, train her up on how to survive. And then people start dropping, but she can feel it coming. And there's this element of, is she right? Is she out of touch with reality? Is she right and out of touch with reality? Like, what's going on here? And then the other half of the book is made up of her essays that she submitted as part of a writing project to her history teacher, Mr. Holmes, about the history and meaning of slashers. And she calls them Slasher 101. And those parts of the book are honestly maybe my favorite, because you see so much of Jade's character and her personality and her, just the way she views the world in these essays about these gory, silly movies. And the way that Stephen Graham Jones lets you see so deep into her psyche just by reading those essays and knowing the circumstances of her life is crazy good. Like, it's genius. It's just masterful the way that he does that. And you see pretty clearly that she uses the slashers as a coping mechanism against the really tough stuff that she's dealing with. So I don't want to say more than that, but this book burrowed into my heart. Jade is probably my favorite horror heroine. I mean, again, I haven't read that many, but I would say she's my favorite by like a long stretch. She's so great. And I just like, I'm not a mother. I'm probably never going to be a parent, but I want to like mother her very badly. And I just want things to be okay for her. And I want her to experience good things. And I'm really scared about the way that the third book is going to end, because she made it through another book. The sequel is called Don't Fear the Reaper. It came out earlier this year. And then February 2024 is when the third and last book comes out. It's called The Angel of Indian Lake. So, oh, I forgot to tell you about the Lake Witch. There's also a witch. There's like a folkloric witch that is supposedly haunting the shores of her town. And there was also like a weird massacre at a summer camp that also influences the stuff that's going around. Like there's just all these ingredients from classic slasher movies peppered throughout this book, where we're supposed to be living in reality, but Jade knows we're all in a slasher. That is my number one horror book favorite of all time so far. So who knows what this list would look like in 2 years, after 2 more years of reading horror, both like trying to catch up with classics like Rosemary's Baby and reading all the great new ones that are coming out. There's just like this such creativity in the genre right now, and I'm having so much fun with it. So I don't know. I hope this rambly ass unprepared video was entertaining to you, and maybe you'll check some of these out, because I stand by all of them. They're all 4.5, 5-star reads. And they are more than worth reading. Hope you have a good rest of your weekend, and I will see you guys probably later next week with my how did I do with my predictions for spooky season video. Farewell. Oh yeah, again, if you guys could like leave a comment, or if you don't want to, leave a knife for a slasher. If you don't want to talk, again, I would really appreciate it, because I'm trying to grow my audience here. So comment or stabby stab. See you later. Bye.